The man woke up every morning to the same familiar routine, one that had become a comforting rhythm in his life. He didn't need much: a small apartment, a job that paid the bills, and his dog. His dog was everything to him. They shared quiet moments together, whether it was a walk through the neighborhood or sitting on the couch in the evening, watching the world go by from the window. To most people, he appeared like any other guy in his mid-40s, someone who kept to himself and stayed out of trouble. He wasn't the type to draw attention, and that suited him just fine. It wasn't that he didn't want friends or didn't enjoy socializing, but he had learned over the years that the less people knew about him, the safer things were. His dog, a large and imposing breed, was his only constant companion. The dog had been with him through everything, through the years of silence, the dark days that he didn't talk about, and even through the nights when nightmares would wake him from sleep. The dog never judged him. It never asked questions. It was just there, a loyal presence in his life. They had a bond, a deep, unspoken connection that few would understand. The man often found himself talking to the dog more than anyone else. He shared his thoughts and his pain, things he couldn't say to another person. The dog would just listen, its eyes calm and understanding. It didn't matter that it couldn't talk back. The comfort it provided was enough. The man worked as a mechanic at a small shop just a few blocks away. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it kept him busy and it paid well enough. His coworkers were friendly, but none of them knew him the way his dog did. He was always polite, always professional, but he kept his distance from everyone. There was a time long ago when he had tried to fit in, but he had learned that people weren't always what they seemed, and sometimes it was better to keep your life to yourself. He wasn't trying to hide who he was, not exactly. It was more like he had learned to bury parts of himself so deep that no one could ever find them. There were memories, events, and people from his past that had shaped him into the man he was today. But those stories, those moments, stayed locked away in his mind. Only his dog knew how deep those scars ran. And the dog never asked. It was a Thursday morning when the man's routine was shattered. He had just finished his breakfast, a cup of coffee and toast with butter, and was getting ready to take his dog for a walk. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft light over the streets. The man slipped on his jacket and grabbed the leash, his dog already waiting by the door, its tail wagging in anticipation. They stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The streets were quiet still. The man liked the mornings. It was the time when the world felt peaceful, before the chaos of the day began. They walked through the neighborhood, past houses with their lights flickering on as people began to wake. The man and his dog were a familiar sight to the neighbors, though no one ever bothered them. The dog was large, intimidating to some, but it never caused trouble. It was just there, walking beside the man like it had done for years. As they rounded the corner, they encountered a police officer parked at the end of the block. The officer's car was idling, and the man noticed that the officer seemed to be staring at them. He had seen this officer before but never spoken to him. The officer was young, probably in his 20s, and still learning the ropes of his job. The man didn't think much of it at first. It was just another encounter, another passing moment in his quiet life. But as they got closer, the officer got out of the car, his eyes fixed on the dog. The dog, sensing something off, growled softly under its breath. It wasn't an aggressive growl, just a low warning. The man kept walking, trying to ignore the officer's gaze. His dog was protective, but it was never violent unless it had to be. The officer, though, didn't seem to take the warning seriously. He took a step forward, his hand hovering near his gun. The man immediately felt a wave of tension. He knew what it looked like. A large dog, the kind that could be dangerous if it felt threatened. But the man knew his dog better than anyone. He trusted it, just as the dog trusted him. "Hey, you need to control that dog," the officer called out, his voice sharp. The man stopped in his tracks, instinctively gripping the leash tighter. He had dealt with situations like this before, people misunderstanding his dog's intentions. But something about the officer's tone made him nervous. It was as if the officer didn't see the bond between the man and his dog, didn't understand that this was a dog that would never attack unless provoked. "It's fine," the man said calmly, trying to defuse the situation. "He's not going to hurt you," but the officer wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his eyes now focused on the dog's teeth, the growl that had come from deep within its chest. He reached for his gun, his finger brushing the trigger guard. The man's heart raced. He had no idea what was going through the officer's mind, but he could see that this wasn't going to end well if it continued down this path. "Get that dog back, or I'll have to put it down," the officer said. His hand now fully on his gun, the man's blood ran cold. He had been in dangerous situations before, situations where he had to think quickly, but this was different. This wasn't a threat from an enemy. This wasn't something he could control with his training. This was a misunderstanding, one that could cost him everything. His dog, sensing his rising tension, began to growl louder, its body tense and ready to react. The officer took another step forward, and in that moment everything seemed to slow down. The man's mind raced. He thought about all the years he had spent in the shadows, all the things he had done to stay hidden, to keep his past buried. But now, in this moment, it didn't matter. It didn't matter how many years he had spent keeping his identity a secret. It didn't matter how much he had tried to keep a low profile. In that instant, it felt like the world was crashing down on him, and his dog was at the center of it. The officer's hand tightened around the gun. The man's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew that this wasn't a situation that could end peacefully. He could see it in the officer's eyes, the fear, the uncertainty. But it was too late. The officer, already on edge, didn't know what he was dealing with. And in that moment, the unthinkable happened. The officer fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the quiet morning, breaking the stillness like a hammer striking glass. The man didn't even have time to react. His dog collapsed, its body crumpling to the ground with a soft thud. The man's legs gave way as he dropped to his knees beside his fallen companion. He didn't speak. He didn't yell. He just knelt there, staring at the dog's lifeless body, a feeling of numbness washing over him. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But it was. The officer, seeing what he had done, took a step back, his face pale. But the man didn't look up. He didn't care about the officer's shock or fear. All he cared about was the dog, the only family he had left lying in the street. And in that moment, the man knew his life would never be the same. The world around him seemed to collapse in slow motion. The officer stood frozen, staring at the dog, its body still in the street, while the man's mind scrambled to process what had just happened. The sound of the gunshot still rang in his ears, a harsh reminder that things had taken a turn he never saw coming. He knelt there for what felt like an eternity, his hands trembling as they hovered over the lifeless form of his dog. His heart was pounding, but his body felt numb, as if the world had stopped making sense. The officer took another step back, his breath quickening. I didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice shaky. But the man didn't respond. He couldn't. Nothing the officer said could undo the damage that had been done. The dog, the one thing in his life that had always been there for him, was gone. The man finally forced himself to look up. The officer was standing a few feet away, clearly uncertain about what to do next. He looked at the man, then at the dog, then back at the man. The weight of the situation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Sir, the officer started, but the man didn't want to hear it. He didn't want any more apologies. There were no words that could fix this. There was no way to bring his dog back. The man slowly stood up, his body stiff with tension. His mind was racing, but it was hard to think clearly. Everything inside him screamed for justice, for the officer to understand the gravity of what he had done. But he couldn't even find the words to express his anger, his sorrow. All he felt was a deep, overwhelming emptiness. He reached down, lifting the dog's lifeless body into his arms. The dog's weight, once familiar and comforting, felt like a heavy burden now. It was as if all the memories, all the years of companionship, had been reduced to nothing more than a lifeless shell. Without a word, the man turned and started walking away from the officer. He didn't want to stay. He didn't want to face the officer's guilt or the growing crowd of onlookers who had started to gather, murmuring quietly amongst themselves. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the dog and the hole it left in his life. He walked home in a daze, barely noticing the world around him. His thoughts were a blur, each step heavy and slow, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. His mind kept flashing back to moments he had shared with his dog. Those quiet evenings, the walks, the way the dog had always known when something was wrong. They had been a team, a pair that relied on each other, and now that was gone. When he reached his apartment, he carefully placed the dog on the floor, wrapping it in a blanket he had kept for such occasions. He sat next to it for hours, not knowing what to do next. His phone rang several times, but he didn't pick it up. He couldn't talk to anyone, not yet. What could he say? How could he explain what had just happened? How could he put into words the loss that felt like a piece of him had been ripped away? The man sat there, the silence of the apartment pressing in on him. He thought about the officer, about the mistake that had cost him everything. But it wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure to understand, to see beyond the surface. The officer hadn't known who the dog was, what it meant to him, or how dangerous it could be if it was pushed too far. But the officer hadn't known the man either. No one did. As the hours passed, the man's anger began to grow. It started as a quiet simmer beneath the surface, but it was building, gathering strength. He wanted answers. He wanted accountability. He didn't know how, but he knew that he couldn't just let this go. He couldn't allow the officer to walk away without consequences. But there was more at stake here than just the loss of his dog. There was something deeper, something that only he understood. He had lived a life that no one else knew about. A life full of secrets and skills that had been hidden from the world, and now it seemed like it was time for those secrets to come to light. The man stood up suddenly, his decision made. He wasn't going to let this go. The officer had made a terrible mistake, but it wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure to recognize who he was dealing with. The man had been trained for situations like this, for moments when his life, and the lives of those around him, could be threatened by those who didn't understand the full picture. But the man wasn't the type to go running to the authorities. He didn't trust them, not after everything he had seen in his past. He didn't need anyone else to fight his battles. He had always been a lone wolf, relying on his instincts and his training to get him through tough situations. And that's exactly what he was going to do now. The first step was clear. He had to get the dog's body to a safe place. There were no funeral homes for animals, no simple ways to say goodbye. Instead, he found a secluded spot on the edge of town, a place where no one would disturb him. It wasn't much, just a quiet spot in the woods, but it would have to do. He buried the dog there as best as he could, saying a silent goodbye as he covered the grave with dirt. The man didn't cry, not because he didn't feel the pain, but because he didn't know how to let it out. There was no time for tears. When he returned home, the man went straight to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old worn notebook, a relic from his past. The pages were filled with codes, names, and plans. It had been years since he had looked at it, but the information inside was still valuable. The man flicked through the pages, each one a reminder of the life he had left behind. He hadn't wanted to think about it, but now it was the only thing that made sense. The officer had made a fatal error, but he wasn't the only one who would have to answer for it. The man's past, his history with Delta Force, was about to come back into play. He had a unique set of skills that few people in the world possessed. And now those skills were going to be put to use, but not for the reasons anyone might expect. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, messages, and covert meetings. The man had connections, people he had worked with long ago, people who owed him favors. They didn't know what had happened to his dog, only that he was in trouble and needed help. The man never told them the full story. There was no need for that. They understood what it meant to be in a tight spot, and they were loyal. Loyalty was a currency he had spent wisely in his past life. As the investigation into the officer's actions began, the man kept to the shadows, watching from afar. He didn't want to draw attention to himself just yet. The time wasn't right, but it would come soon enough. The officer might have thought he was dealing with a simple mechanic and his dog, but the truth was far more complicated. The officer had no idea what he had just triggered. The man's anger was still simmering beneath the surface, but now it had a purpose. The officer's actions were a spark, and the man was preparing to use that spark to ignite something much bigger. The next few days felt like a blur. The man spent his time in a daze, trying to keep his emotions in check while carefully making plans in the background. He couldn't just let the officer's actions slide, not after everything that had happened. But at the same time, he knew he had to be patient. He had to wait for the right moment to make his move. The investigation into the shooting of his dog had begun, but it wasn't moving fast enough for his liking. The officer had been placed on administrative leave, and the media had caught wind of the incident, but that wasn't enough. There were no charges, no clear answers. The man couldn't wait for justice to be served through the usual channels. He had learned long ago that sometimes the system didn't work the way it was supposed to. He spent the following week reaching out to his old contacts. People from his past, people he hadn't spoken to in years but who still owed him. He'd never asked for much from them, but he knew they'd come through for him now. A few calls here and there, some quiet meetings in obscure places, and he began to gather the information he needed. What he was planning wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about punishing the officer for what he had done. It was bigger than that. The man had been part of a world that few people knew about, an elite, secretive group that operated in the shadows. He had been a member of Delta Force, one of the most lethal special forces units in the world. He had seen things, done things that most people couldn't even begin to understand. But he had left that world behind, or so he thought. Now it seemed that world was coming back to find him. He wasn't going to go after the officer directly. That wouldn't solve anything. No, he needed to show the authorities, show everyone that there were consequences for actions like this. He needed to send a message, but not in the way most people would expect. The man spent hours each day reviewing the notebook he had found, the one full of old plans, codes, and contacts. His mind raced as he went over the information, recalling the countless missions, the strategy, the careful planning that had kept him alive all those years. He had learned to think several steps ahead, to anticipate what might happen, to always be prepared for the worst. He wasn't the same man he had been when he was in the service. Time had changed him, softened some edges, but there were still skills deep inside him that hadn't faded. He knew how to get things done without attracting attention. He knew how to make things happen without leaving a trace. But despite his resolve, there was something nagging at him, something he couldn't shake. It was the memory of his dog, the way the animal had looked at him, trusting him to protect it, and how that trust had been shattered in an instant. It was that look that had stayed with him, haunting him, pushing him forward. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about standing up for something bigger. For loyalty, for trust, for a bond that went deeper than anything else. The man knew he couldn't do this alone, so he reached out to a few old friends, people who had been in the same world he had. They were specialists just like him, but they were also just as out of touch with the world they had once known. It took some convincing, but eventually they agreed to help him. The plan was simple, but it would take time. They would begin by gathering intelligence on the officer. They would find out everything they could, his movements, his routines, his connections. They needed to understand the officer's life, to find any cracks in his armor. It wasn't about hurting the officer, not directly, but they needed to make it clear that there were consequences to his actions. The first week passed slowly. Every day felt like a test of patience. The man couldn't stop thinking about the dog, about the life that had been taken so senselessly. He knew that the officer had made a mistake, but the man also knew that it wasn't just the officer he was after. It was the system. It was the misunderstanding of people who didn't understand the real cost of their actions. The days were long, but as the team gathered more information, the man began to feel a sense of purpose returning. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be dangerous, and it was going to take everything he had. But he was ready. One evening, the man received a call from one of his contacts. It was a tip about the officer's next move. The officer was planning to take part in a routine patrol later that week, a night shift that would take him out of the city for a few hours. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The man's heart raced as he processed the information. This was it, the first real opportunity to make a statement. He spent the next few days preparing, making sure everything was in place. His old team had gathered all the necessary intel, and now it was time to act. The officer would be vulnerable during that patrol, away from the safety of the police station. The man would be watching, but he wasn't alone. His team was ready, each one trained to handle the situation with precision and skill. The night of the patrol arrived, and the man was ready. He slipped into the shadows, his movements silent as he made his way to the location where the officer would be passing through. The streets were quiet, the world around him calm. He had always been good at staying out of sight, blending into the background. Tonight was no different. His heart beat steadily in his chest, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what was about to happen. This wasn't a mission, not in the traditional sense. There was no combat, no gunfire. It was about making a statement, about showing the world that there were consequences when people didn't understand the bigger picture. The officer's patrol car rolled into view, and the man held his breath, waiting for the right moment. He could see the officer in the driver's seat, unaware of what was about to unfold. The car slowed as it neared a corner, and in that moment the man stepped forward. Appearing from the shadows, the officer's eyes widened in surprise. But before he could react, the man was already gone, disappearing back into the darkness. The officer was left in a state of confusion, wondering if he had imagined the whole thing. But the message had been sent. It wasn't about fear or intimidation. It was about showing the officer and the world that there were people who operated outside the system, people who had the skills and the will to make their voices heard, even in the shadows. The man didn't wait around to see the officer's reaction. He had made his point, and now it was time to disappear again, to return to the quiet life he had built. But he knew that things were never going to be the same. The officer would think twice the next time he made a decision. And the man would continue to move through the world unnoticed, just as he always had. But something had changed. The man wasn't just a quiet mechanic anymore. He wasn't just someone who kept to himself. He was a reminder that some people had a past that couldn't be buried. He was a reminder that loyalty, once broken, had consequences. As he walked away, the sound of the officer's car fading into the distance, the man couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The dog was gone, but its legacy, its loyalty, had left its mark. The days after the incident felt different. The man couldn't put his finger on it exactly, but something had shifted. There was a weight to the air, something heavier than just grief. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the world, about the systems in place that allowed things like this to happen. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a personal vendetta. This was something much bigger. The officer was still unaware of what the man had done. The patrol incident, the brief moment in the shadows, it had unsettled the officer, left him questioning what he had seen. But the man wasn't finished. He knew that this wouldn't end just with a brief scare. There had to be more. The message needed to be clear, to not just the officer, but to everyone who believed that people like him could be pushed around without consequence. His mind was sharp, focused. He had learned to stay calm in high-pressure situations, and this was no different. The officer would eventually figure out that he wasn't dealing with an average civilian, but that wasn't what worried the man. It was the system, the larger forces at play, that concerned him. The officer was just one piece of the puzzle. The man knew he had to be careful, not just in how he executed his plan, but in how he moved through the world. The quiet life he had built, the life that had been shattered so quickly, was still there, but now it felt fragile. He had spent so many years trying to stay unnoticed, blending in with the background, keeping his secrets buried deep. But everything had changed now. People had started to look at him differently, and the world seemed more dangerous, more unpredictable than it had ever been. He spent his nights working on his strategy. His old team had come through for him, helping him gather more intel on the officer's life. They had dug deep, finding out where the officer lived, where he went for drinks, what his routine was like. The man was starting to understand the officer better than the officer understood himself. But the more he learned, the more he realized how much was still unknown. The officer had a family, a wife, and 2 young children. The man had seen them a few times walking down the street or stopping by the grocery store. It was strange. He couldn't help but think about how different their lives were from his. They lived in a world that was clean, orderly, a world that didn't know the kind of darkness he had lived through, a world that didn't understand how fragile everything could be. But that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was that this officer, this family, was now connected to his pain. The dog, his loyal companion, had been the bridge between their worlds. And now that bridge had been burned. The man didn't want to hurt the officer's family. He had no interest in punishing the people who didn't know what had happened. But the officer was a different story. The officer was the one who had pulled the trigger. The officer was the one who had destroyed something irreplaceable, and he would answer for that. The plan was coming together piece by piece. The man knew that he had to be strategic. He had to find a way to make the officer understand the consequences of his actions, without crossing a line he couldn't come back from. He didn't want to kill anyone. He didn't want to take more lives than necessary. But the officer needed to understand that this wasn't a simple mistake. It was a life-altering error, and the consequences of that mistake had to be felt. The man spent his days at his job fixing cars, blending into the background just as he had always done. His co-workers noticed that he was quieter than usual, but no one asked questions. They didn't know him well enough to notice the subtle shifts, the way his eyes would sometimes glaze over or how his hands would tremble for just a second as he worked. The life he had built around him was still there, but it didn't feel like it was his anymore. He was different now. Something inside him had snapped. One evening, as he was walking home from work, he saw the officer's patrol car parked outside a small bar down the street. The officer was inside, sitting at the bar with a friend, laughing over beers. The man stopped for a moment, watching from across the street. It was strange to see the officer like this, so normal, so human. He had been a shadow to the man for so long, a symbol of the system that had wronged him, and now here he was, just a man having a drink. It almost made the whole situation feel less important, like the officer wasn't some untouchable figure but just another person. But that was the problem. The officer was just another person, and that was exactly what had led to this moment. He had treated the dog like an animal, a threat to be neutralized without understanding. He had acted without thinking, without understanding the consequences. The man turned and walked away, but he couldn't shake the image of the officer sitting at the bar. The man had always believed that the world was full of gray areas, that there were no clear-cut answers. But this felt different. The officer had crossed a line, and now he had to pay the price. The days went on, and the tension between the man and the officer grew. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about sending a message. The man started to feel the weight of the decisions he had made. He wasn't sure what would happen next, or if he would even get what he was seeking. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop until the officer understood the weight of his actions. One evening, he sat in his apartment, staring out the window at the empty street below. The night was quiet, just like it had been the night the officer had fired his gun. But now there was something else in the air. The man could feel it. The calm before the storm. He picked up his phone and made another call, this time to one of his trusted contacts. It was time to make his move. The officer had a routine, a pattern. He was predictable, and the man knew exactly how to use that predictability to his advantage. The officer would never see it coming. The next day, the man followed through with his plan. He knew that it would be risky, that it could blow up in his face, but he couldn't turn back now. He had been pushed too far. The officer had taken everything from him, and the man wasn't going to rest until the scales were balanced. As he set his plan in motion, he couldn't help but wonder if there was any part of him that still wanted to go back to the life he had before. The quiet, unnoticed life with his dog by his side. But that was gone now, and now, the only thing that mattered was ensuring that the officer paid the price for what he had done. The man had spent his entire life in the shadows, and now it seemed he was finally stepping into the light. But he wasn't sure if it would be a light he could ever escape from. The night had finally arrived. The man stood in the shadows, watching the officer's routine unfold just as it had so many times before. His heart wasn't racing. It wasn't filled with adrenaline or anger anymore. It was filled with something else, a deep sense of finality. What had started as an attempt to make a point, to ensure justice for his fallen companion, had become something bigger, something irreversible. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had worked in the background, gathering information, making calls, following the officer's every move. He knew the officer's routines better than the officer did. The officer had no idea what he was walking into tonight. The man had debated for a long time about how far to push this. He had come so close to giving it all up, to returning to his quiet, unnoticed life. But every time he thought about the officer, about the gunshot, about the dog lying lifeless in the street, he felt the anger stir in him again. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been building inside him for years. The officer's patrol car rolled into view, just like it always did. The man didn't flinch. He was used to the routine by now. He had seen this moment in his mind countless times. He was prepared for it. But the weight of it, the consequences of everything that had happened, still hung in the air. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the final step, but he couldn't stop now. Tonight, it wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. It was about making sure that the officer understood the magnitude of what he had done. The man had learned over the years that you didn't always get second chances. Sometimes life didn't give you the opportunity to take back what had been lost. And so, here he was, about to finish what had started in the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The officer parked his car in the usual spot, stepping out and locking it behind him. The man took a deep breath, staying out of sight in the shadows of a nearby alley. He had learned to move without being seen, to be a part of the background in ways that made him invisible. Tonight he would be invisible again, but this time it wasn't to escape. It was to ensure that the officer could never forget what had happened. He took one last glance at the officer, who was walking toward a small building, his head down, unaware of the eyes on him. The man's steps were deliberate, silent as he followed from a distance. The officer seemed distracted, not noticing the shadow moving behind him. The man knew this wasn't the right time yet, not until they were alone, far from the prying eyes of the world. It wasn't long before the officer disappeared into the building. The man paused, waiting for the right moment. He could hear voices inside, another officer perhaps, a friend, a colleague. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the officer was alone in just a few minutes. The man would make sure of that. The man's mind raced with memories of the life he had once lived, a life that felt so far removed from the quiet existence he had tried to build for himself, a life where every decision had life or death consequences, a life where loyalty and trust had meant everything. But now, the only thing that mattered was making sure the officer felt what he had felt. The loss, the betrayal, the crushing weight of knowing that something irreplaceable had been taken from you. He had done everything he could to avoid situations like this. He had avoided contact, avoided confrontation. But now the past was pushing him forward, forcing him into a confrontation he couldn't ignore. The officer emerged from the building, his face slightly flushed from the conversation inside. He was talking on his phone, his attention distracted, still unaware of what was waiting just a few feet away. The man could hear the officer's voice, the casual nature of the conversation, and it hit him again, the stark difference between the officer's life and his own. The officer was living in a world where the consequences of his actions didn't seem to matter. But the man had been living with those consequences every single day. It wasn't until the officer reached the corner of the street that the man took his first real step forward. He moved quickly but silently, keeping his distance, never once drawing attention to himself. The officer's voice trailed off as he turned down a narrow side street, still absorbed in his phone call. The man was closing in, his every movement calculated, precise. The officer turned into an alley, his back to the man. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The alley was dark, quiet, perfect. The officer, still unaware, was walking further into it, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The man could hear the rustle of the officer's uniform, the faint sound of his breath. This was the time. The man stepped forward, and then he spoke. "Do you remember me?" The officer spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. His eyes went wide with shock as he recognized the man standing before him. The tension was thick, and for a brief moment the officer hesitated, unsure of what to do. His training kicked in, but the man knew that there was no way the officer could act fast enough. This wasn't about violence. It wasn't about fear. It was about the simple truth of what had happened. "You shot my dog," the man said, his voice calm but firm. The officer's face shifted. His shock was replaced by guilt, then confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but the man raised his hand, silencing him. "I didn't come here to hurt you," the man continued. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came here to make sure you understand what you did. Do you understand that?" The officer swallowed, his throat dry. He nodded slowly, his eyes wide. I didn't know. I thought he was a threat. I didn't mean to." "I know," the man replied. "But you still did it. And now you have to live with that." The officer stood there, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The man's gaze never wavered, never softened. He wasn't here for forgiveness. He wasn't here for an apology. What he needed was the officer to understand the gravity of his actions. The man turned and began to walk away, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He didn't need to say anything more. The officer wouldn't forget this night. He wouldn't forget the man who had stepped out of the shadows, who had reminded him that there were consequences in this world, even when you didn't realize it. As the man disappeared into the night, he felt something strange, a sense of release, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The dog was gone, but its legacy remained. The officer had learned his lesson, and now, the man could return to the life he had built, the life he had tried so hard to protect. But the world wasn't the same anymore. Nothing would ever be the same. And though the man had gotten what he came for, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment when his quiet life would truly end. There were no guarantees in life, no promises that you could walk away unscathed. But for now, at least, he had achieved what he set out to do, and that, in the end, was all that mattered.